You're watching a recording of the Joint Public Issues Team National Conference 2020. This session is called Living in a Poverty-Free Economy and is facilitated by Paul Morrison.
I'll tell you a little bit about myself, that I work with JPIT and I've been doing their work on poverty and inequality for a little while. But my background is as a scientist. I used to design vaccines for a living, and I love graphs and I love data, and human beings are a mystery to me. But you're going to get your graphs and you're going to get your data, don't worry, that's in the bag. But I thought I would start, given this was in some way a church meeting, with a quote from the Bible, and one that you might find, or three that you might find unusual. And it's something that is told to me all the time. When I go to churches, they say, well, I think it's great that we're on the side of the poorest in society, but the poor will always be with you. And it's said in three places. And in one of them, it's a disciple that says it to you. I'll tell you the story, in fact. The story is that Jesus is anointed by a woman with really, really expensive perfume. And then in one of the stories, it's a disciple. In one of the stories, it's some person. And on the latest written of the Gospels, it's Judas, which tells you what we think of the next question if you make it Judas saying it. And it basically is, that was really expensive perfume. You could have used that to help the poor. And Jesus responds, the poor will always be with us. And what he's doing there is referring back to another part of the Bible, Deuteronomy. And he's referring back to a part of the Bible which is all about the rules of how you run your society. It's about rules around debt. It's about rules around production. It's about rules around what you do with your surplus. It's about how the rules you run your society. If you want to think about poverty, think about those. Don't think about the little bits of charity that you can do along the side. Think about poverty being core and not having poverty being core to how you run the world. And this is a picture of the First Methodist building. I'm an Ulster Presbyterian who found the Methodist Church and married a Methodist woman and thus fell in love with Methodism in many ways. And this is the First Methodist building. It was in 1738, Wesley arrives there. And it's actually an abandoned cannon factory. And amusingly, it had no roof on. So the very first Methodist project was a roof fund. And we've been doing that in memory of Wesley ever since. But in that, it was in East London, and it was in a really deprived and poor area. And of course, because it was a religious group, they did worshipping of God. But they also did things that we would recognize today. They had a clothes bank. They had what would be a food bank. They had a dispensary of loans. They even did loans to small business people to start so that they could start earning a living. But very quickly, it became clear that some of the problems were about the structure of society, and that doing that charity and doing those good works and those kindnesses was not enough. And this is a picture, it's a rather stylized rather stylized drawing. And the caption underneath says, "Here is a guinea, get your husband released from prison." And at that time, when you went to prison mainly for debt. And when you went to prison, you had to pay room and board. So in order to get out of prison, you had to both pay off the original debt and you had to pay your room and board for when you were there. And it was the man, the breadwinner of the family, who often went into prison. So you had families driven to absolute desperation, driven to stealing, driven to crime, driven to prostitution, in order to get enough money to get their breadwinner out of prison. And so, the Methodist Church, the first things that the Methodists campaigned about from that building, and we talk quite a lot about campaigns around slavery, but actually the first thing that they campaigned about was around prison reform, was about how we change the system so that these people don't come to us needing loans and needing food and needing help. Let's change the structure such that people don't need the help that we're giving. And it is the same today. This is from the report by the Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, Philip Allison. And he says that the experience of the United Kingdom, especially in 2010, underscores the conclusion that poverty is a political choice. That some people took that to say that the politicians wanted poverty, and I think that's incorrect, and I don't think that's what Philip Allison meant. But the poverty that we saw was caused by how we chose to run our society. It was caused by the political choices that were made for good or for ill. And lots of talks about poverty in the UK, and lots of talks about poverty are done by people like me. White, middle class, really haven't experienced poverty in my entire life. And we draw our graphs, and we tell our stories, and we think we're the experts. However, when we should start when thinking about poverty is from the people who experience it themselves. And this is a video done by Joseph Rowntree Foundation last year. And it's just of one single mum in Glasgow. There's a theme running through this entire day, talking about her experience of poverty over the years. You could play that.
Hi, my name is Hazel. I am a single mum from Fife. My sons are 17 and 15. I have been on my own with them since their dad walked out when they were young. Since then, I've either struggled on benefits or I've been working, but with just one income, it's never been enough. I have worked full-time for a good decent wage, and then I have worked part-time for minimum wage, and there's never been much difference. When working full-time, I didn't get tax credits or housing benefit, and I was living on my wage alone. Then working part-time, with a little top-up of tax credits and housing benefit, it still left me with no more than previously. For me to get a better wage and a decent quality of life, I would really need to be earning a much higher wage. If I compare things to an object, it would be a hamster's wheel. No matter how hard I work and how much I push myself, I still feel I'm getting nowhere. I feel like it's a never-ending journey with no end. It feels like I am working and pushing myself so hard, but I'm just going round in circles and going nowhere.
And the experience of poverty has changed over the past 20 years, maybe 30 years. And for many people in our churches, they're quite grounded and rooted in an idea of poverty that really existed in the 1980s. And it started to change quite rapidly from then. So I thought that what I would do is, in this bit of input, which will last sort of 10, 15 minutes, is to tell you how poverty changed over the last 20 years, and to tell you about the policies that caused it to change over the last 20 years. That poverty changed because of choices that we made. And then after that, we're going to talk about what choices we could make that are different from that. And that's where you'd put the hard work in. So I wanted to say something about poverty in the UK today. This is a number I use everywhere I go 14.3 million people. That's just over 1 in 5 people experience poverty. There are lots of different ways you can measure poverty. There are lots of different schemes for doing it. We're using the Social Metrics Commission one. And that's because it's been agreed by people from right and left wing. It's been agreed across the sector. Because for the last 10 years, there's been a really unpleasant and unhelpful debate where when poverty numbers were mentioned, people shouted, what's poverty? This is the agreed number. When this goes up, everyone agrees there's more poverty. And I want to give you an idea of what the standard of living of somebody who falls into that category is. I think in churches, often what we think of as somebody who is not well off would be somebody living only on a state pension, maybe with their rent, either owning their own house or their rent paid for by housing benefit. So that feels quite low. That person would be well above the standard of living required to get into this poverty measure. A third to a fifth, depending on all sorts of circumstances. So poverty in the UK is real, and it means that, and to be counted in this number, you have to have seriously constrained means and constrained ways of living. And one of the other things that people say is that poverty in the UK, it doesn't really matter. It's not like poverty in other places. It's not like poverty in Africa or in other places where poverty's proper. Experiencing poverty in the UK has a dramatic effect on your life from the moment you were born until and as you grow older. So I use this graph. I could use hundreds. There's 19, I think the last statistics published this week, it's 19 and a half years healthy life expectancy. That is the difference between the richest fifth and the poorest fifth. This graph, and I'm going to use a laser pointer. I feel like I've arrived. I haven't arrived because I can't see it. Oh, there it is. This is the poorest, and this is a measure of primary school children with mental health problems, and it's done from the Millennium Cohort Survey. And if you're in the poorest fifth, around a fifth of primary school children will have mental health problems. And if you're in the richest fifth, it's under 2%. And there's all sorts of measures I could tell you to convince you that experiencing poverty in the UK matters to you. It matters to you from the moment you're born until you get older. And something else about poverty in the UK is this is the sort of age dimension of it. Excuse me. The group who are most likely to experience poverty are... I didn't know I could do that. I have powers I didn't realize. The group who are most likely to experience poverty are children. They experience poverty, their rate is about 34% at the moment. So over 1 in 3 children experience poverty in the UK. The group least likely to experience poverty are pensioners. And that's a dramatic change. The peak of pensioner poverty was 1992, where it hit 38%. It's now down, it bottomed out at 12%, it's just crept up in the last 2 years to 14%. But in terms of age, the group least likely to experience poverty are pensioners, with the rest being working age adults. And one of the things that's changed dramatically is that in the 1980s, poverty was about age, and it was about not working. It was being unemployed. But today, poverty is about being in work, and these different blues are about work intensity. So that's 3.3 million people in families where 2 people work full-time, yet still experience poverty. 3.9 where there's 1 working full-time, 1 working part-time. And then the 1.8 million where there's only 1 person working part-time. They're almost exclusively single parents who are balancing caring responsibilities with some work. So this group who have no work, the number who are unemployed is very small, and it's constantly changing and it's churning. They're moving from no work to in work to no work to in work. The group who are stuck there have either got long-term caring responsibilities, or the majority are sick or disabled, and that is the reason they are not working. So when you talk about worklessness, most people hear worklessness and they internalize the word unemployment. But worklessness, you should internalize the word ill. And then about 1 million people who experience poverty are retired. And some groups experience poverty at a much different rate. The group who experiences it at the highest rate at the moment are single parents. It's extraordinary, but over half of single parents meet that definition of poverty in the UK today. Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities have got a much higher rate of poverty. Sick and disabled people, again, have a much higher rate of poverty. And overall, children have a much higher rate of poverty, with single parents and children in families where there's more than 2 children are the other big groups and the big spikes in poverty. And these data are collected before. There's a rule that is going to be rolled out over the next 4 or 5 years, whereby universal credit will only support the first 2 children in a family, no matter how many children there are in that family. Which means that this group, their rate of poverty is expected to go up. It's expected to affect around about 200,000 children are meant to be pushed into poverty because of that. And there's something else, that poverty in the UK today is young. There's almost a direct correlation between your age and your risk of poverty. And what's more concerning, the poverty rate is decided by incomes. What's really concerning is that people who are at university and who are leaving university, their incomes aren't as high as they were 10 or 15 years ago. So having a graduate job doesn't bring in as much income. But what's really concerning and is not captured in a poverty measure is that that group's also not acquiring wealth. So they've got debts from university, but they're not being able to save. They're not able to invest in stock markets, which Catherine Tebek was talking about with a certain amount of skepticism. But they weren't allowed to, so they're not able to accumulate wealth. So they're not getting that start either. And we thought maybe it was just something that happened after the crash, that people who came out of university got lower wages. But it's persisted, and it looks like it's a cohort effect. It looks like that generation is just going to start off on less money. And they're going to start off with debt, and they're not going to accumulate wealth. And that is something we should be profoundly worried about. So I've talked a bit about how poverty in the UK has changed, what the differences are, how it's moved from being old to young, how it's moved from being out of work to in work. There are reasons as to why that happened. And there are 2 big things. Over the past 30 years, say from the 1980s to maybe 2010, I've been calling that 30 years. I'm older than I think. That's terrifying. But from about the 1980s till 2010, it was largely changes to the structure of how the economy worked and how people were rewarded within the economy. Since 2010, those changes have continued, but the big change was in how we had a safety net and how the welfare state was changed, such that people who didn't get enough from the economy but were given something via the welfare state, that amount of money moving towards them dried up. And so the increases in poverty in the last 10 years have been about that. That's not a great slide. But I have to tell you, this is my favorite graph. And I've got it I'm only showing you 3 lines. what you do is you get the incomes and you line them up. You line up incomes in centiles, so you've got 100 of them. And then you track how each centile has done from 1961 until it's 2018 is that data. And I can draw that graph with 100 lines, and it makes me so happy. But I'm only giving you 3. That dark line is what happened to the median family, the 50th centile, the middle. The dark green line is what happened to the poorest families. And the light line at the top is what's happened to the richest, the 90th centile. And what happened was that there was sort of a bouncing along, and then we hit the 1980s, and you see this huge surge. And this is take-home income after tax and after benefits. So you see this huge surge, but actually the bottom is continuing as it was. And the middle is deviating slightly. But what's happened since then is that surge has continued. And the middle started to get better off, but actually that's fairly much stopped now too. The bottom has flattened out completely, and the top are moving along reasonably well. But this is another graph, and it's a measure of income inequality, and you can see the change is that in the 1980s, income inequality shot up. And actually, it stayed fairly stable since then. But the big thing that happened at the end of the 1980s was that gaining assets or gaining money for your family started to not be about work. Increasingly, it was about what you owned. So my brother bought a flat in Edinburgh, not Glasgow. And he's a bursar at a school, which is a very hard job that, the level of stress he puts up with is enormous. But for 8 solid years, the value of his flat in Edinburgh increased more than his salary. So in terms of bringing wealth to his family, what he owned was more important than the work he could put in. And that trend continued. So people who owned things, what they had increased in value, their houses, their stocks, their shares. Yeah. And one of the big changes that happened was that during the 1980s, we decided that the major thing you needed to do in an economy was keep inflation at around about 2%. And if you keep inflation at around about 2%, people who have mortgages get a fairly constant rate. They're not going to be shocked by that. The risk is taken out of things like mortgages. Prior to that, we actually we cared about other things other than just inflation. And we had something called an incomes policy where we wanted the inflation rate and the incomes of the average person to be balanced. And that went out of the window in the 1980s. So what we have is a transition from working being the way your family got money to owning things being the way your family gets money. And that's another graph. This is the Nationwide Building Society index of the average house, in which the value of houses shoot right up. And in London, on average, 2.2 times median income goes up to 5.5 times median income. So houses become increasingly unaffordable. If you owned a house at that time, that's good for you. If you need to buy a house later, it's really not so good for you at all. And this is, all of my graphs have been about income, because you can measure income really well. And the Inland Revenue is really keen on measuring your income really well, so we've got good data. Wealth is much harder to measure, but there's been now 4 waves of wealth inequality statistics produced since 2009. And total wealth is what you own. And that means things like your house, your stocks, your pension, and the stocks and shares within that, as well as the things you have about the house. And it's a huge exercise in measuring this. But one of the interesting things that happened was that in this decade, even as we thought we had a very poor economy, even as we thought we were recovering from a massive economic crisis, the top income decile's wealth increased by about 20%. And if you go to the Office of National Statistics website, you will see that net national wealth increases at about 7% a year, even if incomes are staying relatively static. In fact, it was only 2 weeks ago that the average income in the UK hit the level that it was in 2008. But the other thing you see there is the poorest income decile, the lowest income decile, actually lost wealth during this decade. And that's fairly unprecedented from what we can tell. So we've moved from caring about income inequality, and when people talk about inequality, they usually talk about income inequality. Wealth inequality is much more important. And we measure and we capture taxes on income really well. But we don't tend to tax wealth at all. There's something called capital gains tax at a lower rate than income tax, and it's particularly inefficient tax. There's lots of ways of getting out of it. So I've talked a bit about how the structure of the economy changed, and these are my last few slides on how the welfare state changed in the last 9 years. These are from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and their incomes of people, how they were affected by the changes to taxes and benefits since 2010 to 2019. And for the group who are pensioners, the poorest lost about 2% of their income, and the richest lost a part of their income, and the middle section did relatively okay. And for working age families without children, which is that green line, which is the slightly light green line, it was slightly worse than pensioners, but actually the pattern is fairly much the same. And here we have working age with children, who lose around about 12% if you're in the poorest tenth of society of their income. So our choice, we could have done all sorts of other things, but our choice was to change the benefit system such that that happened, such that it was the poorest children who lost out most from those changes. That's another graph just to show the effect. This is from Equality and Human Rights Commission. But the blue bars are what you lost if you were a single adult with no children, and orange with children. And for a single adult, that's about £5,000 a year, which has really profound effects. It both drives people into poverty, but if you remember, poverty has always been high amongst single parents, which means those who are already in poverty are being hit by this. So it makes poverty darker and deeper for people who are already there. So I've talked about the changing face of poverty, and I've talked about possibly the mechanisms by which it's changed. And I'm not going to tell you about the benefits of quantitative easing. I'm going to forgive you that. If you ask me afterwards, I'll get very excited and talk to you all about it. Sorry, the slide's gone a bit weird. I'm going to do something now, which I was driving up with Rachel in the car, and I was working out how we could get this group of people to talk. And Rachel had a great idea, and I have to say Rachel had a great idea because she's about to do my development review. And she's marvelous. I'm just like to say that. But if you could find somebody who you don't really know, and if you just get into twos, now you don't have to hug and kiss or shake hands and spread diseases, but if you could get into twos and chat only about that first question, what would a flourishing economy look like in your community? I think it should be in your community. It should be rigorously focused on what it would look like in your community. Because all of this high-level stuff, people start fighting about the levers and the mechanisms of delivering. What we actually need is a vision of what it is we want, where it is we want to steer the economy to. So if you could find somebody you don't really know, say hello to them. Think about what a flourishing community would like, what flourishing economy would look like in your community, and I'll come back to you in about 5 minutes and tell you your next task.
Thank you for watching this recording from the JPIT National Conference 2020. For more great resources, visit our website, jointpublicissues.org.uk.